Welcome to the Crane Bag Podcast. I am Jay Leeming. Today we're going to continue our exploration of the Iliad and all the stories around it. We take up our story with Paris, who has just made the choice among the three goddesses and has spent the night in the hut he shares with his foster father, Agilus, and now he is setting out for Troy. Shall we begin? Let us begin. So Paris walked through the forest, down from the heights of Mount Ida towards the city of Troy. And he was dressed in his finest clothes. He had on a coat he'd made himself. It was green and embroidered with images of birds and of leaves. And across the back he had put the image of a great golden yellow mother bear. So he walked, and after a time he came to a high meadow. He was still so high up on the mountain that he could see hawks soaring above the forest below him. But from there, standing in those long grasses, he could see far off something glimmering, and it was the city of Troy. He could see its towers. He could see its great walls, and beside it the river Scamander shining in the sun, and beyond it all the sea. Years later, when he faced Achilles on the battlefield before those very walls, when he held a spear in his sweaty hands, he would remember that moment, for it was his first glimpse of Troy. And as he walked down that mountain path, he thought of all the stories he'd heard about Troy, stories told to him in the darkness of night by Oenone, the river spirit. And she had told him how the walls of Troy had been built by gods, how once all the gods had risen up against Zeus, and he had put down their revolt, and he had sentenced two of them, the ringleaders, Apollo and Poseidon, to do hard labor for an entire year for a man named Laomedon, who long ago was the king of Troy. So they'd set to work, but Apollo and Poseidon had made sure that they had a human man to help them, for they knew that if the walls were built entirely by the gods, then the city could never be defeated, never be destroyed. It would be eternal, just like the palaces of the gods in Olympus itself. So they got a man named Aeacus to help them, and the three of them labored for an entire year. And at the end of that year, the walls of Troy were stronger than those of any city in the world. And they'd gone to King Laomedon for their payment, but he said, "This was all payment to Zeus. I owe you nothing." And so Apollo and Poseidon had gone off with anger in their hearts. And that very day Apollo called a great plague down upon the city. It took the old and the very young. They died in their sleep. So there was great despair in Troy at this sickness brought upon them by Apollo. And not only this, but one day a farmer came into the throne room of Troy, and he stood before King Laomedon, and he said, "Your Majesty, animals have been disappearing from my farm. Others say the same. Just the other night I was awoken by a shrieking sound. So I grabbed hold of my sharp sword and went outside. My dogs were too frightened to go out with me. And I saw nothing in the darkness, but I heard a great slobbering, shrieking sound. I heard my pigs squealing in agony, and then a great crunching sound, and then a sliding, scraping noise that went across the land and across the sand and back into the sea. And as time went on, this monster became bolder and bolder. Soon it came out even during the day. It would crawl from the sea and attack a farm. With its tail, it would bash against the walls of a barn, and as the panicked pigs ran out, it would devour them there in the sunlight. And then it would thrash that barn some more until it fell to the ground, and then it would claw through the wreckage and devour the bellowing bulls trapped inside. So Troy was in despair, and King Laomedon journeyed to the Delphic oracle. And there he listened to the words of the dragon priestess, and she told him that he must sacrifice his only daughter Hesione to the monster, and if he did so, the monster would be appeased and would never trouble Troy again. So Laomedon returned to his city, and there in the throne room he told his daughter what the Delphic oracle had said. And Hesione said, "Father, you have brought this evil upon our city, not I. You must find another way." King Laomedon looked at her. "I will do what I can," he said. So King Laomedon sent messengers to every corner of his kingdom, proclaiming that whoever could destroy this monster would be rewarded with 2 snow-white magical horses given to King Laomedon by Zeus many years before. So the news spread. But though the kingdom of Troy was filled with many people who were strong, powerful, or clever in various ways, none of them felt they could defeat this sea dragon sent by Poseidon. So the days went on, and still the people of Troy lived in fear, for no rescuer came to destroy the sea dragon. And each day another cow would be eaten, another barn smashed to pieces, another herd of pigs swallowed, devoured by the beast. And finally there came a day when King Laomedon summoned his daughter Hesione to the throne room, and she came and she stood before her father. And he gave a word, and suddenly 4 burly soldiers stood beside her, and 2 of them grabbed her by the wrists. "What does this mean, father?" she said. "I'm sorry, my dear," he answered. "There is no other way." And as Hesione shouted and cursed at her father, the 4 soldiers dragged her away outside the walls of Troy and chained her to a great rock which stood there. And the sea crashed, and the waves swept up the beach. And that day, as on every other day, the sea dragon came crawling from the surf, slithering through the fields towards Hesione, the princess, chained to a rock. And she struggled against those chains, but found them too strong to break, and so she began to weep, the sea dragon coming closer and closer towards the weeping girl. But suddenly, from around the walls of Troy, there came a man running. He was dressed in a lion's skin. He had a bow and arrows strapped to his back and a great club in his hand. And it was, of course, Heracles. And he came to Hesione, and he smashed all of the chains binding her to the rock. "You're free," he said. "Run, you're free, go!" And she ran back to the city, and Heracles turned and faced the sea dragon. And he took 3 arrows, poisoned arrows, and he shot them with his bow straight at the hide of the great monster, but they bounced clean off and away. The hide was too thick. And then he ran up to the side of it, and he gave it a great blow with his club. Wham! And then another. But the sea dragon noticed nothing, for its hide was like stone. So this monster ate 3 pigs from a nearby barn, and then went slithering up to the walls of Troy. And with its claws it began to work at the stones there, prying them apart, starting to work at tumbling them away. So Heracles ran up to the sea dragon, and he lifted his club high in the air, and he brought it down and dealt a smashing blow to the back leg of the monster. Now it was hardly hurt at all, but it was annoyed as we might be annoyed by a fly. So it turned and it faced him, and its purple tongue lashed out, and Heracles began to run. He ran straight for the monster, and he gave a great leap, and he landed on that purple tongue, and then he took another leap, and he dove right down the throat of that sea dragon, and the sea dragon closed its mouth, and Heracles was gone. The people of Troy, watching from the high walls of the city, saw all of this, and they shouted in despair, "Heracles has been devoured! Heracles has been devoured!" And the monster went to work on the walls once again. All day it bashed and pummeled at the city of Troy. But then, strangely, in the afternoon, it began to get tired. This had never happened before. And it turned from the city of Troy, and it crawled across the land and slithered back into the sea. Well, the next morning, with renewed energy, the sea dragon came out of the waves. And again it ate a cow, and then it devoured a horse, and then it came to the walls of Troy, and again it pounded upon the walls. Everyone inside could feel it. The spoons on the tables rattled as it shook and thundered those great walls. And with its claws it again tried to pry them apart, and then again the animals seemed to get tired. And the monster turned, he staggered, he coughed, he seemed kind of ill, and he went away across the fields, and he knocked over a barn with his tail. He staggered like he was drunk, but he was too weak this time to go back to the sea, so he simply curled up in a field of long grass with his tail wrapped around his head. And all night long the sea dragon slept. And on the 3rd day, again with renewed energy, the sea dragon awoke, and it came towards the city, but it was ill. It was clearly ill, and it staggered this way, and it shambled, and it could barely get the strength together to pound on the walls, and the spoons inside did not rattle any more. And the monster turned and began to head towards the sea, and late in the day it came to the sand, moving slowly, slower and slower, and then its eyes flickered, and it gave a great gasp, and it died in the sand. And then, as a few farmers and shepherds began to approach the sea dragon from a great distance, its side began to rumble and shake, and then a great wound opened up in the side of the monster, and out of it stepped Heracles. He was covered in gore. He staggered forward, dead tired. He left footprints behind him of blood in the grass. He walked forward, and then he fell into the river Scamander, face first, plunged down, and he lay there looking up at the sky as the water of that river washed all the blood of the sea dragon from him. And then Heracles climbed out onto the bank and lay down exhausted in the grass. And it was then that everyone looked, and they saw that now Heracles was entirely bald, and that in fact every hair on his body had been stripped away, eaten up by the toxic forces in the belly of that great beast. So at last the people of Troy rejoiced, thankful that the sea dragon was dead and would trouble them no more. But the thing is, King Laomedon refused to give the white magical horses to Heracles. When the king told him this, Heracles said nothing. He just looked at the king with eyes of fire, and then he turned, and without a word he walked out of the throne room and away from the city. But some time later he came back with a great army, and he besieged that city, and finally, conquering it, he entered the city, came to the throne room, and he killed Laomedon there and then. But in fact, the people were not sad or angry at this, but glad. They didn't want to give a funeral to the king who'd brought so much evil upon them. They wanted to scatter his bones to be eaten by the dogs, or perhaps given to the sea to be devoured by the crabs. But the Sibyl of Troy spoke up and said, "The evil of King Laomedon is a part of our story. We must accept it, and by so doing we will be made stronger. So I say this. Take his bones and seal them up in the wall of the city, right by the Scaean gate. And so long as they remain there, this city cannot be conquered or destroyed by any army upon this earth." And as Paris walked through the forest, remembering this, he also remembered what Oenone had told him, that in fact in one of the great libraries of Troy, there, amidst all the scrolls, there was a great wooden chest. And in this wooden chest there were kept, still to this very day, the claws of the sea dragon. And he remembered also how long ago, when Laomedon's ancestor Dardanus was king of Troy, one day a great stone had fallen out of the sky, wham, and landed right there in the grassy fields before Troy. And shepherds and goatherds ran to see what it was, and they found a great crater, and in the center of that crater a glowing red stone, still smoking from its passage out of the sky. And King Dardanus and the Sibyl of Troy were sent for, and they came to that crater. And as the stone cooled and the smoke blew away, everyone could see that it was a statue of Athena. And the Sibyl said, "This is the Palladium, for it is sacred to the goddess Pallas Athena. We must take it and place it in a secret place in our city, and make offerings to it and honor it with our gifts. For it is a gift to us from the gods. And so long as it is kept safe, so long as it is honored in this way, then our city shall be safe from the storms and the armies of this world." So once the stone had cooled, they placed it on a wagon, and they wheeled it into the city. And then they took it down and down into a secret cavern below the city. And there, to this day, the people of Troy make offerings to this statue, offerings of wine and of sweet words and of blood and of flowers. And in this way, the city of Troy is protected. So these stories came back to Paris as he walked. And then suddenly the path led out from between the trees and out onto the Trojan plain. A grass-covered plain miles long, and looking into the distance he saw the city itself. And as he walked closer and closer, He saw the great Scaean gate before him, and he thought of the bones of old King Laomedon, and he wondered if in fact they were there in that stone wall on that very day. And he walked into the city. But the strange thing was the city seemed empty. There was hardly anyone there. There were guards at the great gate, yes, and here and there an old man or an old woman, here and there a dog or a chicken. But in fact the streets were deserted. For such a large city it seemed like everyone had left. He walked further into the city, going up and up, for it was built upon a hill. And then suddenly, as he stood there in front of a blacksmith's shop and an empty bakery, he heard a great roaring sound as of thousands of people cheering. And in fact, that's exactly what it was. So he followed this sound, and at length he came to the great arena of Troy. And he went to the gate, and there were 2 guards there, and he went up to one of them, and he said, "Sir, please tell me, what is the occasion today? What is this great celebration for?" And the guard said, "This is not a celebration exactly, but these are funeral games for the son of Priam and Hecuba, the king and queen, their son Alexander, who 18 years ago they surrendered to the mountain. For they had heard a prophecy which said that if he was allowed to live, he would bring about the destruction of all of Troy, that the city itself would be completely destroyed until hardly one stone stood upon another. So they surrendered their son Alexander to the mountain 18 years ago on this day. But they've always remembered him, so each year on the day of his death there are funeral games in his honor. But stranger, please go in, enjoy these games, and see for yourself." So in a daze, Paris walked into that arena. There were thousands of people cheering. All of Troy was there. And near the center of the arena, there was a stand covered in white cloth and in gold. And in this stand sat Priam and Hecuba, the king and queen of Troy, surrounded by all their children. Hector was there, glorious Hector, their eldest son, and also Deiphobus and Troilus and Polites, and many others as well, all dressed in their finest clothes. And right there beside Priam was a young woman, and she was wearing a dress that was the deep blue color of the sky right before darkness falls. And as Paris stepped into the arena, suddenly she looked far off into the distance. Suddenly a spell seemed to sweep over her, and she said, "He is here. He is here. Fire, death, destruction." "What's that you say, my dear?" said Priam. "Fire, death, destruction. He is here. Send him away. Cast your son away. Cast your son away." "What are you raving about now?" said Priam. "I will cast none of my children away, for I love all of them, even you, Cassandra, though you say such strange things." And a moment later there was a great blast of music from many golden horns all sounding at once, and everyone in the arena went quiet. And beside King Priam, Cassandra whispered, "Fire, death, destruction. Let the funeral games begin." And Priam stood up and he said, "Let the funeral games begin!" And a shout went up, and all through that arena people began to wrestle and to throw the discus and to hurl the spear long distances, and a foot race began around the edge of that arena. And Paris walked through it all in a daze, marveling at everything he saw. "It's true," he thought to himself. "It's true. I am a son of Priam. I am a prince. These games are for me." Around him, the people of Troy shouted and cheered and chanted the names of the ones who they wanted most to win. And Paris walked through the crowd, and he came to where the foot race was happening, and he entered that race, after first taking off his green coat and laying it down carefully on a wooden bench. And he ran as fast as he could, and he won that race. And all day the contests went on. And then, late in the afternoon, when Helios, the sun god, was driving his chariot towards the sea, all of the winners, including Paris, gathered in the center of the arena, and Priam and Hecuba walked and stood before them. And beside Priam there was a servant holding a great plate covered in garlands of flowers. And Priam said, "Congratulations to all of you. You are the ones the gods have chosen to win today. So we honor you as we honor the gods, the deathless ones, and as we honor my dear son Alexander, dead 18 years ago now on this day." In the silence that followed his words, he picked up a garland of flowers and placed it around the neck of the winner of the wrestling competition. And he went in this way from one to the next, those who had won the discus and the spear throwing and the boxing and all the winners there. And then he came to Paris, and he held the garland of white flowers in his hands, but he paused. "Who are you, young man? For I have never seen you before." And Paris said, I'm a boy from the forest." "A boy from the forest? What forest is that? This is a day for the people of Troy. This is a day for the citizens of my glorious city, and not for those from far away. If you are from a distant place, stranger, then, well, this is not the place for you. Then I think perhaps you must leave. So tell me, tell all of us, where are you from? Who are your parents? Who are you?" Suddenly, Paris was aware that everyone in the arena was looking at him. He could hardly speak. I'm Paris," he said weakly. And then, far off, at the gate of the arena, a voice said, "Paris! Paris Alexander! That is who you are!" And everyone looked, and there in the gateway of the arena there stood a stocky man, dressed in a green coat with red hair, and he was holding a silver rattle high into the air. "You are Paris Alexander!" And this man, who was, in fact, Agilus, walked through the crowd, and he came straight to the center of the arena, and he knelt down before Hecuba, and he said, "My queen, this is a silver rattle belonging to this young man who, for these last 18 years, I have called my son. But this rattle belongs to him, and it also belongs to you, for he is your son as well." Hecuba reached down. She took hold of this silver rattle, and she looked at it closely. Memories began to flood through her. She looked at the names, Hector, Cassandra. They were all there, all her children, and at the end, written in small letters, she saw the name Alexander. And in that sparkling moment, it all came back to her. How 18 years before, when she'd been heavy with child, she'd had a dream that she'd given birth to a boy made of fire. And as she dreamed, this boy ran through the streets of Troy. And everywhere he stepped, fire leapt out of the ground. And he trailed his fingers along the walls of the houses, and every house he touched burst into flame. So in her dream she was choked with smoke. She could hear the beams above her head, the beams of the palace, cracking and splintering, falling down upon her. "Troy is on fire! Troy is on fire!" And then she awoke. Her husband Priam was beside her in the royal bed. "It's all right," he said. "It's all right, my dear. Just a dream." She looked. The candlesticks on the walls were there, the tapestry as well. Everything was in its usual place. "Only a dream," Priam said. Well, in the darkness, she told Priam her dream. And the next morning the two of them went to the Sibyl of Troy, and they told her their dream. And the Sibyl said, "My queen, I have hard news for you. For this child you are carrying, when he is born, he must be killed. For if he is allowed to live, by his actions he will bring about the destruction of Troy and the death of thousands, perhaps even all of the royal family. So if you wish to save yourself and your city, kill him. Kill him as soon as he is born. That is what I see, my queen. That is what I see, my king." Well, this was a difficult thing, and they trusted the words of the Sibyl. But still, the day after Alexander was born, they found it very difficult to kill him on that day. They could not bring themselves to do that. So, weeping, Hecuba gave him up to 3 soldiers and commanded them to take the baby and expose him on the rocks of the highest peak of Mount Ida. They nodded, hearing her words, but the baby wailed and cried in their arms. So Hecuba, in grief, reached into her pocket, and she pulled out the silver rattle. She shook it in the air so that it rang out, and then she placed it gently into the soft hands of her infant son. And then, weeping, she turned away. and the soldiers got on their horses and galloped away towards Mount Ida. And now that very rattle was in her hands. She looked up from it at Paris. "My son," she said, "my son?" "Yes, mother," said Paris. "Yes, I've come home." And she reached out and held him in her arms as she had so many years before. And the tears fell from her eyes and from Agillus's eyes as well. And Priam said, my son, you've come home." And he embraced Paris, and there was much weeping. And then Priam turned and said, so that everyone in the arena could hear, "My son has returned. My son, Paris Alexander, has come back. It is a joyous day." And hearing these words, the entire arena erupted into a great cry of joy which echoed throughout the city. But beside Priam sat Cassandra, looking into the distance, whispering words that no one else could hear. "Fire, death, destruction." Hello, hello. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for attending to it. What a wild story, huh? It's got all kinds of stuff in it. Sea monsters, Cassandra, who sees the future, Heracles. Where do you go in this story? Where do you find yourself? Look around you right now, this second. Are you in this story in some way? Are you the Sibyl speaking to the people, the truth you know? Are you Heracles down there in the basement belly of that animal, fighting your way out? Are you Paris, setting out for a city you have never seen, never been to, but have heard stories about? Well, maybe you're in this story and maybe you're not, but I invite you to entertain the possibility that in some way you are, and that you can find yourself in this story, in this map of a condition of the soul, which is what stories are. We begin with Laomedon, that king, and he's just, he's no fun. He's a jerk, basically. And he's got this sea monster problem because the gods built the walls. It's great. I love these stories. You just tug on them, and pretty soon you got the whole thing there before you, as I've said before. Pretty soon you have to explain the whole universe. You know, if you touch one thing, one flower, it's connected to Mount Rushmore and Michelangelo and Madonna and the depths of the sea. So in this story we find that is true also. Paris is walking to Troy, remembering stories of that city which he has heard. And we hear about this sea monster, a sea dragon sent by Poseidon. But, of course, it's sent because the gods revolted against Zeus, and Apollo and Poseidon were punished, etc., etc. Anyway, I just thought this story was really cool. It's kind of a footnote. It's a minor story in this whole corpus, in this whole vortex of Troy stories. But I just really liked it, especially the detail of Heracles being in there for 3 days. Wow, what is that about? Amazing. I mean, it's your standard hero kills monster story, kinda, but then you get that detail. He's in there for 3 days. And he comes out and he's bald. He's lost all his hair. Hair, that symbol of life. We express ourselves with our hair. We shape it, style it in all kinds of ways. Wild men and women are seen as being covered in hair. When you start over, frequently you cut your hair, right? That's what a monk does. He cuts his hair. Nuns in some traditions do that as well. Buddhism, for example. A friend of mine got a divorce and he shaved his head. It's a clean start. It's a starting over. It's a sign that you have entered a different realm of life, a different level. Not necessarily a better one, just a different one. Perhaps larger, perhaps different. And so Heracles, when suddenly he's got no hair, that seems like a sign, a clue to me, that he's gone through something serious which has changed him in a permanent way. That's what initiations do. You are permanently different. Now, we'd have to look at the story of Heracles to see if that's actually true. And, perhaps it's not. Perhaps he doesn't change his behavior or change what he is in any significant way. But I feel like there's something in there. Maybe it's way back. Maybe it's been obscured. But there's this sense that you enter the beast and you come out different than you were before. How could you not? How could you not be different after spending that time in there, in this sea dragon with the purple tongue? Wild. And Laomedon, like I say, kind of a jerk, doesn't pay Heracles. I guess you could say there's some basis for not paying Apollo and Poseidon because Zeus told them to do it, but still, he could have given them something. But then with Heracles, it's just straight up, I'm not paying you. I said I'd give you these horses. I'm not, which is just a reprehensible thing to do. And Heracles comes back, kills him, etc., etc. But what I find interesting is the Sibyl of Troy says you got to put his bones in the wall of the city. Wow, that's really cool. I mean, check it out. So the bones of this king, who was an evil king, let us say, are going to protect us. So this king doesn't protect us by his actions. In fact, maybe the opposite. His cruelty brought on all kinds of bad stuff to our city. But by putting his bones in the wall, we are protected. I don't know. I want to lean into this and say that, if we remember the crimes of our ancestors, if we remember the foolishness and the evil that they did, that they were capable of, that will protect us, like a wall protects a city. So slavery, so the genocide of the Native Americans, attempted genocide of the Native Americans. So whatever you want to name, whatever evil it is you particularly remember, and make it a family thing in your family. What is it? Forgetting that doesn't help us, but remembering it somehow does. And almost an honoring of it. His bones are in the wall. Is he honored by that? I don't know. But he's part of the protection of the city. So I could sit with that thought for a while. By remembering the crimes of the past, we are made safe. And we can sit in our houses inside of Troy and drink our tea or our whatever, our beer, our mead, whatever, and be safe and secure, because those crimes did not exactly protect us, but our memory of them does. And we are wiser. We know what humans are capable of, what we, living in this city and living in this family, this tradition, this bloodline, are capable of. So that's something I think about. And then there's this rock falling out of the sky, the palladium. And the Sibyl also says this must be honored and protected and kept safe, and it will keep our city safe. Throughout these stories, there's this sense that we have choice, we have initiative, we can make decisions, and yet not everything is up to us. and the gods can do things, and fate has an effect upon us. And I find that an alien thought to more or less how I was brought up, the culture I was brought up, America, modern culture. We like to think we have choice. We got choice. It's all up to us. Do whatever you want. I'll decide everything. But these stories tell us we don't have choice necessarily. Or maybe it's not either or, it's both and, right? We do have choice, but not everything is under our control. And so Troy must be protected by soldiers, walls, etc., peace negotiations, all these things, but it must also be protected by this statue, by these bones in the wall, these sort of non-rational ways of looking out for number one, of making sure that Troy is on good terms with the unseen forces as well, and is protected against them, protected from them. I mean, fate is just a heavy thing, right? We walk down the street. You walk down the street, any of us. And how do we walk down that street? What determines that? Well, in one sense, we do, because we're like, oh, I'm going to X place. I'm going to whatever, the store. So you walk down the street. And the way you walk can be determined by choice if you want. You're like, okay, I'm going to lift my left leg and wiggle it around this time. I'm going to swing my arms this time. But in fact, I mean, that's possible. But also the way we walk down the street is affected by our biology, our genetics, the bodies we have. It's affected by the culture we're in. Certain cultures move in different ways than others. And it's determined by our emotions. If we're happy, we walk one way. If we're sad or filled with sorrow, we walk a different way. These are all things we wouldn't necessarily acknowledge consciously. When we walk down the street, we wouldn't make a decision. Oh, I'm happy, I'm doing this. Oh, I'm sad, I'm doing this. But all these forces are in there in the way we walk down the street so clearly that someone else can see it and can see you coming and knows perhaps your mood, knows perhaps where you're from culturally. And so these things are all there. And so we call that the unconscious. When you walk into a room and you sit down in a chair, what determines how you sit? Are you sitting up straight? Are your legs crossed? Are your hands in your pockets? Are you slouching? Are you not? Those are all unconscious elements. And yes, we can choose to change them, but most of the time we don't. Most of the time we're just going ahead, thinking our thoughts, and there's this vast sea of the unconscious, filled with feelings, emotions, hate, love, revulsion, joy, filled with cultural patterns, filled with things we've been taught, things we've seen, things we've heard. And that has a pull and a tug on us and determines much of how we are in the world. So in these stories, which come from way back, about 3,000 years ago, give or take, those forces are acknowledged, I feel. And they're acknowledged through these oracles, the Delphic oracle, through the Sibyl of Troy, the seers we will see as we go forward in the story. Armies have seers who guide them. And so those are all ways of contacting that other realm and giving it voice. And when we get to Troy, we meet one of the more famous of these, which is Cassandra, who is the voice of the underworld, the voice of the river below things, flowing beneath the day. And what she has to say is often just shadows and death. It's a marvelous character, really, I have to say, just as a storyteller, just to have this character as a mouthpiece for the unconscious, for the instinctive, for the instinctive nature of this story. And what she says is not believed. That's her curse. And just so you know how that happened, well, Apollo thought she was beautiful, wanted to sleep with her, and Cassandra said no. And he said, well, I'll give you the art of prophecy if you sleep with me. If you sleep with me, I will give you the power, the craft. I will teach you how to see the future and know what is coming. And she agreed to this. And he taught her how to be a seer of the future. And then she refused him. And she's like, well, I actually lied. I'm not sleeping with you. And he then cursed her, never to be believed. So it's interesting. This puts her in line with her ancestor many generations back, Mr. Laomedon, who ripped off Apollo and Poseidon, and then Heracles as well, and suffered for it, and brought suffering on his city for it. Cassandra doesn't bring suffering to her city, but clearly she suffers because she knows what's going to happen. She warns people, and they do not believe her. That's just part of the deal. They never believe her. They will not believe her. Wild. Have you ever felt like that? Have I ever felt like that? Well, maybe I have. I'm a parent. So when you're a parent, it's little stuff, but it's like, well, kid, put your hat on, you're going to be cold. And your child is like, well, no, I'm not putting your hat on. And then a little while later, I'm cold. Well, you didn't put your hat on, So as a parent, I guess sometimes I feel that. Politically, do we feel that? Maybe on the left and the right, huh? The left-wing side being, well, if you elect Trump, it's all going to be chaos and death and destruction, right? The other side, the Trump supporters, would say, well, you let all those immigrants in, then this country's going to pieces, We both have our fears. We all have our fears. And we all might feel like we warn the world and the world doesn't listen. Because that's the nature of the world. It's not just this curse, perhaps, that Apollo gives to Cassandra, but just the nature of the world. It's a big, wild thing with its own impulses, instincts, and urges. And you tell people what's going to happen because you see it, and they don't believe you. And they go forward, and you run into the brick wall, and the disaster happens. So that's Cassandra's fate, is to know the disaster is coming and to be unable to do anything to stop it. Whew. Climate change, anybody? Political disaster, anybody? Fires in the hills, wildfires, hurricanes. Yeah, so perhaps some people feel that way even today. So it's fascinating just to have that character right there for us, Cassandra. And how she deals with this, we shall see. It's not spelled out how she gets these visions. I'm sort of assuming she doesn't get them all at once, because that would be just a lot to carry. Maybe they come in fits and starts. Some sort of spell comes over and she sees a little bit into the future, but not all the way. Nevertheless, I don't think she just keeps railing at everybody forever and warning them forever. I think at some point she makes a decision to deal with it in a different way. And we shall see what that way is. Also, of course, all of these things in this story are seeds for the future. That palladium, we know Troy is going to be destroyed. So somehow that palladium has to get out of there, has to be removed from that cavern, that place which is sacred to the goddess. Those bones as well, somehow they got to be taken from that wall. How are the Greeks, the Achaeans, the Danans as they're called, how are they going to figure this out? How are they going to do it? Well, tune in next week or in 6 weeks. I don't know. It'll take us a while. I'll just say, obviously, we could have skipped a lot of this. We could have just said, hey, Paris makes a decision. He picks Aphrodite in the judgment there, shows up at Troy. They're all like, hey, we love you. And off he goes to find Helen. But I wanted to give you the whole story because these stories are valuable and they're worth remembering. They are worth attending to and worth listening to. And they have existed for a long time for a reason. Apparently, the Trojans were sometimes called derogatorily sons of Laomedon, whenever you felt they were going to lie to you or rip you off in some way. So people remembered that story and used it in their dealings, in their thinkings about life. And so these stories are that for us. They are tools for us as we go forward into this world. There are more stories on my website, jayleeming.com, JAYLEEMING.com. And you can support this podcast at patreon.com, patreon.com/storyjl. That's it. That's the place. That's the locus. The place to go. Not the locust. The locus. You know what I mean. That's the place. And that's what keeps this free. There's over 120 episodes now. Whoa, 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 yay! And they're free because people support this podcast. If you can do so, please do so. And while you're at it, don't just offer to me. Offer to the story. Give it a little gift. Make it something. Make it something. Write a little poem, or carve a little stick, or weave together something, or give it something of value to you. A little wine, a little honey, chocolate, cornmeal, whatever it is you think this story needs. Why do such a wacky thing, such a thing that seems so goofy to us industrial, smartphone-owning human beings? Well, it's a way of being in relationship with this story. It's not just something Mr. Jay Leeming thought up. It's not just something in a book, but something which exists in the world beyond us, beyond me and you. And it would be a good thing if we were in deeper relationship with everything in the world, the coal in the ground, the trees, the water, the air, and story as well. So that we don't just treat story as something to be mined out of the ground of memory, and then eaten for its deliciousness, but we give something delicious in return. So this story is alive and can sing again in a time beyond our own, beyond this time in which we stand. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and take care.